My wife ripped up my college diploma during an argument for thinking I'm better than her. I watched the paper tear in slow motion, the heavy cardstock separating along the fold first, then shredding into irregular pieces as Natasha pulled her hands apart with enough force that her knuckles went white. The diploma had been framed behind glass for 8 years, hanging in my home office, until she'd pulled it off the wall 30 seconds earlier and smashed the frame on the corner of my desk. Now she was standing in a circle of broken glass, holding the remnants of something I'd worked 4 years and taken on $80,000 in student loans to earn. The pieces fell from her hands like confetti, drifting down onto the hardwood floor between us. She was breathing hard, her face flushed red, and she looked at me with this expression of triumph mixed with rage. Then she said those exact words, her voice shaking. "Maybe now you'll stop thinking you're better than me." I stood there frozen, because part of my brain couldn't process what had just happened. This wasn't some replaceable object. This was my bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from a state university I'd busted my ass to get into. This was proof that I'd been the first person in my family to graduate college. This was something my parents had cried over when they'd watched me walk across that stage. And Natasha had just destroyed it, because we'd been arguing about whether I should take a promotion at work. I'd met Natasha 5 years earlier at a friend's barbecue in the summer after I'd graduated. I was working my first real engineering job at a manufacturing company, making decent money, finally able to start paying down my student loans. She was working as a receptionist at a dental office and taking night classes at the community college. We hit it off immediately, and I was drawn to how different she was from the women I'd dated in college. She seemed grounded and practical, not interested in the party scene, focused on building a stable life. We talked for hours at that barbecue about our families and our goals and what we wanted from life. She told me she admired people who pushed themselves to achieve more, that she respected ambition and hard work. I told her about growing up in a working-class family where no one had gone to college, about my mom who cleaned houses and my dad who worked construction, about how they'd encouraged me to get an education so I wouldn't have to break my back for a living. Natasha said that was beautiful, and that I should be proud of what I'd accomplished. 3 months later, we were dating exclusively. 6 months after that, I introduced her to my parents. They loved her immediately, loved how polite and charming she was, how she asked them questions about their lives and seemed genuinely interested in the answers. The first year of our relationship was intense in the way new relationships are when you're falling hard and everything feels perfect. Natasha would surprise me at work with lunch, would leave sweet notes in my apartment, would tell me constantly how lucky she was to have found someone like me. I helped her with her coursework when she struggled with math classes, tutored her through algebra and statistics until she was pulling B's instead of C's. She dropped out after a year and a half, said college wasn't for her, and that she'd rather focus on working and building practical skills. I supported her decision because I believed everyone should follow their own path. She got a job as an office manager at a small insurance agency and seemed happy with the work. We moved in together after dating for 2 years, got a nice 2-bedroom apartment where I could set up a home office. That's when I started noticing small things that didn't quite add up. She'd make comments about how much time I spent working on projects at home, side consulting work I did to make extra money for our savings. She'd say things like, "Must be nice to have skills people will pay for." In this tone I couldn't quite read. I'd ask if something was wrong and she'd say no, she was just joking around. I told myself she was probably stressed from her job and that I was being oversensitive. By our 3rd year together, the comments became more frequent and more pointed. Natasha would bring up my education in arguments about completely unrelated things. We'd be discussing what to have for dinner, and somehow it would turn into her saying I probably thought I was too good for normal food because I went to college. We'd be watching TV, and she'd make a comment about how the character reminded her of me, always thinking he knew everything because he had a degree. I started walking on eggshells, careful about mentioning work or any achievements, because I didn't want to trigger her anger. When I got my first promotion at work after 3 years with the company, I waited 2 days to tell her because I was nervous about how she'd react. She congratulated me, but then asked if I thought I deserved it, or if they'd promoted me just because I had the right credentials. The question stung because it implied I hadn't earned it through my actual work. I tried to talk to her about why she kept bringing up my education, and she said I was imagining things, that she was proud of me, and I was being paranoid. I wanted to believe her, so I dropped it. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. We got married in our 4th year together. It was a small ceremony, just family and close friends, nothing extravagant because we were saving money for a house. My parents were thrilled, and Natasha's mom seemed happy enough, though I'd noticed her mom made similar comments sometimes about people who thought they were smart. I brushed it off as a family quirk. The wedding was nice, and the honeymoon was good, and I thought maybe marriage would settle some of the tension that had been building. For a few months after we got married, things improved. Natasha seemed more relaxed and affectionate. We started looking at houses in good school districts because we were talking about having kids eventually. I got another promotion at work, this time to senior engineer, with a significant raise. I was excited to tell Natasha because it meant we could afford a nicer house sooner than we'd planned. I came home that evening with flowers and a bottle of wine, ready to celebrate. She was in the kitchen making dinner and I told her the news. She put down the knife she was using to chop vegetables and stared at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Congratulations," in a flat voice, and went back to cooking. I asked what was wrong, and she said nothing. She was happy for me, but her body language said otherwise, and we ate dinner in tense silence. That night after dinner, Natasha started asking me questions about the promotion. Who else had been considered for it? What made me more qualified than them? Did my boss know I went to a state school, or did he think I went somewhere prestigious? The questions felt designed to undermine my achievement rather than celebrate it. I told her I'd gotten the promotion because I'd led 3 successful projects in the past year, and my work spoke for itself. She said, of course, that's what I thought, that I always had an explanation for why I deserved good things. I asked her what that meant, and she said I wouldn't understand, because I'd never had to work for anything the hard way. That comment made me angry because she knew exactly how hard I'd worked to get through college, how I'd had 2 jobs and a full course load, how I'd graduated with honors despite having to support myself financially. I reminded her of all this, and she said that was different, that school was just memorization and tests, not real-world work. The argument escalated until I finally went to sleep in the guest room because I couldn't handle it anymore. The pattern continued over the next year. Every achievement at work became a source of tension. When I was asked to present at a national engineering conference, Natasha said it must be a slow year if they were letting someone from my background speak. When I was featured in the company newsletter for an innovation that saved the company significant money, she barely acknowledged it. When colleagues would email me asking for advice on technical problems, she'd read the emails over my shoulder and make snide comments about me being everyone's go-to genius. I started hiding my accomplishments from her, downplaying successes, avoiding talking about work entirely. My parents noticed I seemed stressed when they visited, and my mom pulled me aside to ask if everything was okay in my marriage. I told her everything was fine, that we were just adjusting to new responsibilities. She gave me this look that said she didn't believe me, but she didn't push it. I wasn't ready to admit that my wife resented me for the education I'd worked so hard to earn. Things came to a head when I was offered a director-level position at a competing company. It was a huge opportunity, a 40% salary increase, leading a team of 15 engineers, working on cutting-edge projects in renewable energy. The recruiter who contacted me said I'd been recommended by several people in the industry, and that my reputation for innovative problem-solving had gotten their attention. I was thrilled and terrified at the same time. This was the kind of position I'd dreamed about but hadn't expected to reach until my 40s. I was only 31 years old, and someone wanted to make me a director. I knew I needed to discuss it with Natasha before accepting, but I also knew how she'd react. I waited until the weekend when we were both relaxed, or as relaxed as we got anymore. I told her about the offer and tried to gauge her response. She was quiet for a long time, just sitting there processing. Then she asked why I thought I deserved a director position when I only had 8 years of experience. I explained that the company valued innovation over tenure, and that my track record spoke for itself. She said it must be nice to have so much confidence in myself. I asked if she was happy for me, and she said of course she was, but her tone said the opposite. Over the next week, Natasha became increasingly hostile about the job offer. She'd ask questions designed to make me doubt myself. Was I sure I could handle the responsibility? Did I realize I'd be managing people who might have more experience than me? What if I failed and embarrassed myself? I tried to talk to her about why she seemed so opposed to this opportunity, and she denied being opposed, said she was just being realistic and asking the questions I should be asking myself. But her realism felt like sabotage. She started bringing up every mistake I'd ever made, every project that hadn't gone perfectly, every time I'd struggled with something. She was building a case for why I wasn't qualified, why I should turn down the offer and stay where I was. I started doubting myself in a way I hadn't since my freshman year of college, when I'd felt like an imposter surrounded by people from better high schools. I made an appointment with a therapist, Dr. Leonard Hayes, who specialized in work-life balance and career transitions. I told him I was trying to make a major career decision and was experiencing unexpected resistance from my spouse. Dr. Hayes asked me to describe the resistance, and I laid out the whole history of Natasha's comments about my education and achievements. Dr. Hayes listened carefully and then asked me a question that hit like a punch to the gut. He asked if Natasha had ever celebrated my successes without qualifying them somehow. I sat there trying to think of an example and couldn't come up with one. Every achievement had been met with either silence or subtle undermining. He asked if she'd ever encouraged me to pursue opportunities or if she consistently talked me out of them. Again, I realized the pattern was clear. She'd talked me out of pursuing my MBA, out of taking a job that would have required relocating to a better market, out of teaching an engineering course at the local community college. Dr. Hayes used the term professional sabotage and explained that some partners feel threatened by their spouse's success and unconsciously or consciously work to limit it. He said the diploma on my wall, the thing I'd worked so hard for, probably represented everything about me that made her feel inadequate. He suggested couples counseling and said if Natasha wasn't willing to do that, I needed to seriously consider whether this marriage was sustainable. I left his office feeling both validated and deeply sad. I'd been making excuses for Natasha's behavior for years, telling myself she was just insecure or stressed, when the reality was that she actively resented my success. I accepted the director position despite Natasha's objections. I'd spent too many years minimizing myself to make her comfortable, and I wasn't willing to sacrifice this opportunity. The day I gave notice at my current job, Natasha barely spoke to me. My start date at the new company was 3 weeks away, and I tried to use that time to repair some of the damage in our marriage. I suggested we see a counselor together, and Natasha refused, said we didn't need a stranger telling us how to communicate. I tried to involve her in the transition, talking about how the increased salary would help us buy a house sooner, but she showed no interest. My parents threw me a small celebration dinner, and Natasha came but sat in silence most of the evening, making excuses about having a headache. My mom pulled me aside again before we left and said plainly that she was worried about me, that Natasha didn't seem supportive, and that wasn't what marriage should look like. I promised I'd handle it, but I had no idea how. The argument that ended with my diploma in pieces started over something completely mundane. I'd been at the new job for 2 weeks and had a big presentation coming up for the executive team. I was in my home office on a Saturday afternoon preparing slides, and Natasha came in asking if I wanted to go to her friend's birthday party that evening. I told her I couldn't, that I needed to finish this presentation because it was critical for getting buy-in on a major project. She said I was always choosing work over her, that I'd missed the last 3 social events she'd wanted to attend. I pointed out that I'd just started a demanding new job and needed to prove myself in these first few months. She said there it was, my need to prove I was smarter than everyone else. I told her that wasn't what this was about, that this was about doing my job well. She said my job was all I cared about, that she could disappear, and I probably wouldn't notice as long as I had my precious career. The argument spiraled from there, both of us saying things we'd been holding back for months. I told her I was tired of her resenting me for being successful, that her constant negativity was exhausting. She said I was arrogant and condescending, that I walked around acting like my degree made me special. I said my degree represented years of hard work and sacrifice, and she had no right to diminish that. That's when she looked at the framed diploma on the wall behind my desk. She walked over to it deliberately, and I watched her reach up and grab the frame with both hands. For a second I thought she was just going to straighten it or something, but then she yanked it off the wall hard enough that the nail ripped out of the drywall. The frame hit the corner of my desk, and the glass shattered. She looked down at the broken frame, and then pulled the diploma out, pieces of glass falling onto the floor. I told her to stop, my voice coming out strangled, but she ignored me. She held the diploma up in front of her face like she was reading it. This document that had my full name and my degree and the date I'd graduated, all in formal calligraphy. Then she grabbed it with both hands and tore it straight down the middle. The sound of it ripping was surprisingly loud in the quiet office. She tore it again and again until it was in small pieces, and then she let them fall. Some of the pieces landed on the broken glass and some scattered across the floor. She was shaking and crying and telling me that maybe now I'd understand what it felt like to lose something that made me feel valuable. I looked at the pieces of paper on the floor, and something inside me broke just as completely. I left the house without saying another word. I drove to a hotel and checked in for the night because I couldn't be in the same space as Natasha. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I called Dr. Hayes' emergency line and left a message. He called me back within an hour, and I told him what had happened. He asked if I was safe, and I said yes. I was at a hotel. He asked if I planned to go back, and I said I didn't know. He told me that what Natasha had done was a form of emotional abuse, that destroying something precious to someone is an act of control and intimidation designed to break them down. He said I needed to document everything, take photos if I could, and seriously consider whether I wanted to stay in this marriage. He gave me the name of a divorce attorney named Grace Whitmore, who specialized in contentious separations. I thanked him and hung up and sat on the hotel bed staring at the wall for hours. I'd been married for less than 2 years. I'd promised my parents and Natasha's family and everyone who'd been at our wedding that this was forever. But forever with someone who would destroy my achievements out of spite felt like a life sentence. I went back to the house the next morning when I knew Natasha would be at work. I took photos of the destroyed diploma on my office floor, making sure to capture the torn pieces and the broken frame and the hole in the wall where it had hung. I gathered all the pieces and put them in a plastic bag, because some part of me couldn't just throw them away. Then I packed a suitcase with clothes and important documents and left again. I called my friend Dennis, who I'd known since college, and asked if I could stay with him for a while. Dennis and his wife Lydia had a spare room, and they said I could stay as long as I needed. I showed up at their house that afternoon with my suitcase and the bag of diploma pieces. Lydia took one look at my face and gave me a hug without asking questions. Over dinner that night, I told them everything, the whole history of Natasha's resentment and the pattern of sabotage and the final destruction of my diploma. Dennis was quiet for a long time, and then said he'd never liked how Natasha talked to me, that he'd noticed years ago how she'd find ways to put me down in social situations. He said he'd tried to say something once, but I'd gotten defensive, so he'd backed off. I apologized for not listening, and he said there was nothing to apologize for, that it was hard to see clearly when you were in the middle of something. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. Natasha called me 15 times that first day. I didn't answer any of the calls. Then the texts started. At first they were angry, accusing me of abandoning her without explanation. Then they shifted to desperate apologies, saying she'd been out of line and wanted to talk. Then they cycled back to angry, saying I was overreacting to one mistake. I saved every message and forwarded them to Dr. Hayes and to the attorney Grace Whitmore. I made an appointment with Grace for the following week. She worked out of a sleek office downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive art on the walls. She was in her 50s with short gray hair and sharp blue eyes that had probably seen every variation of marital dysfunction. I walked her through the relationship history, the escalating resentment, the professional sabotage, and finally, the destruction of my diploma. She listened without interrupting and took detailed notes. When I finished, she asked if there had been any physical violence, and I said no, never. She asked if there had been financial abuse, and I realized I wasn't sure. She asked me to pull up our bank account records, and we went through them together. That's when I discovered Natasha had been transferring money from our joint savings account into a separate account in her name only. Over the past 6 months, she'd moved almost $25,000 without telling me. The discovery of the financial deception felt like another betrayal on top of everything else. Grace explained that in our state, money earned during the marriage was marital property, regardless of who made more, but that secretly moving funds and hiding assets was a problem that would work in my favor during divorce proceedings. She asked if I wanted to proceed with filing, and I said yes. She explained the process, the timeline, what to expect from Natasha's likely response. She said I should prepare for her to either love-bomb me to try to get me back or turn vicious and vindictive, possibly both in cycles. She drafted divorce papers that week and had them served to Natasha at her workplace on a Thursday afternoon. Natasha called me 41 times within the first 3 hours after being served. I blocked her number on the advice of Grace. Then Natasha started showing up places I went. She came to my office building and tried to get past security to see me. The building security supervisor, a former cop named Ray Donovan, called me down to the lobby and told me there was a woman claiming to be my wife who was demanding access. I told him we were separated and in the process of divorcing and that I didn't want her in the building. He escorted her out and told her she wasn't allowed to return. She waited in the parking lot for 3 hours until I left work, then followed my car for 20 minutes until I pulled into a police station parking lot. She drove away when she saw where I was going. I filed for a restraining order the next day based on the harassment and following. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Grace prepared me for what to expect and said Natasha would likely show up with her own attorney, claiming I was exaggerating normal divorce distress. The judge was a woman in her late 60s named Diane Kirkland, who had a reputation for being no-nonsense. Natasha showed up with an attorney named Philip Green, who looked fresh out of law school and completely overwhelmed. Judge Kirkland reviewed my petition and the evidence I'd submitted, including photos of the destroyed diploma, screenshots of the excessive calls and texts, and a statement from Ray Donovan about Natasha trying to access my workplace. Natasha's attorney argued that she was just a heartbroken woman trying to save her marriage and that I was being cruel by refusing to talk to her. Judge Kirkland asked Natasha directly if she'd destroyed my college diploma. Natasha started to cry and said yes, but that it had been a moment of weakness, that she'd been overwhelmed by emotion and had made a terrible mistake. The judge asked if she'd replaced the item or offered any restitution. Natasha said she'd tried to apologize, but I'd refused to listen. Judge Kirkland looked unimpressed. She granted a temporary restraining order requiring Natasha to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my workplace, and Dennis and Lydia's house. The order was effective immediately and would remain in place until the divorce was finalized. The divorce process dragged on for months because Natasha contested everything. She wanted spousal support, even though she had a full-time job, and we'd only been married for less than 2 years. She wanted half the value of my retirement accounts, even though most of the money had been contributed before we married. She wanted me to pay her legal fees because I made more money than she did. Grace fought every unreasonable demand, and we finally reached a settlement after 6 months of negotiations. I would keep my retirement accounts and my car. She would keep her car and the furniture from our apartment. We'd split the remaining joint savings account 50-50, which meant I'd get back half of the money she'd secretly transferred, plus half of what remained. Neither of us would pay spousal support. I'd pay for the costs of having my diploma replicated by the university since the original had been destroyed. The total cost to me for the divorce, including legal fees, was almost $35,000, money I'd been saving for a house down payment. But I was free, and that felt worth any price. Throughout the divorce process, I continued seeing Dr. Hayes to work through the emotional aftermath. He helped me understand the psychological patterns that had kept me trapped in the marriage, the way I'd minimize my own needs and achievements to avoid conflict. He helped me rebuild my sense of self-worth that had been systematically eroded by years of subtle put-downs and resentment. He said I'd been experiencing something called tall poppy syndrome, where Natasha had tried to cut me down every time I grew or achieved something because my success made her feel inadequate. He said this wasn't about me being arrogant or condescending. It was about her own insecurities that she'd chosen to weaponize against me, instead of working through them herself. The sessions were painful, but necessary, and I started to feel like myself again, the confident person who'd graduated with honors and built a successful career without apologizing for it. I reconnected with friends I'd distanced myself from during the marriage. I focused on excelling at my new job and leading my team effectively. I started exercising regularly and taking care of myself in ways I'd neglected. I was rebuilding my life piece by piece. The divorce was finalized on a Monday morning in family court. Judge Kirkland reviewed the settlement agreement we'd reached and asked if we both understood and agreed to the terms. I said yes. Natasha said yes, in a small voice. The judge signed the decree, and it was done. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in years. Grace shook my hand and told me to take care of myself and not to let anyone diminish me again. I thanked her for everything and meant it. That afternoon, I went to my university's registrar office to request an official replacement diploma. The woman helping me asked why I needed a replacement, and I told her the truth, that my wife had destroyed the original during our divorce. She looked sympathetic and said she'd put a rush on it. 2 weeks later, I received a package containing a new diploma, identical to the one Natasha had torn apart, except for the recent issuance date printed small at the bottom. I had it framed in unbreakable acrylic instead of glass, and hung it in my home office in the apartment I'd rented for myself. Looking at it on the wall felt like reclaiming a part of myself that had been under attack for years. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I was thriving in ways I hadn't thought possible. My team at work had successfully launched 2 major projects, and I'd received recognition from the company's executive leadership. I'd been invited to speak at 3 industry conferences and had published an article in a major engineering journal. I'd started dating someone I met through friends, a woman named Olivia, who had her own successful career as a veterinarian and who seemed genuinely proud of my achievements rather than threatened by them. We took things slowly, and I was careful to watch for red flags, but everything about being with her felt healthy and balanced in a way my marriage never had. She asked about my diploma one day when she was at my apartment, and I told her the whole story. She was horrified that someone would destroy something that represented so much work and sacrifice. She said she couldn't imagine being with someone who didn't celebrate her partner's success, and I realized that's exactly what a healthy relationship should look like. I ran into Natasha one time after the divorce, completely by accident at a coffee shop downtown. She was with someone who looked like a new boyfriend, and she saw me at the same moment I saw her. We both froze, and I watched her face cycle through several emotions, surprise and anger, and something that might have been regret. I nodded politely and turned back to wait for my order. She didn't approach me, and I didn't approach her. We were strangers now, people who'd once shared a life but had nothing left to say to each other. I got my coffee and left and didn't look back. Dr. Hayes and I had talked about the possibility of running into her, and he'd helped me prepare for how to handle it without getting drawn back into old patterns. I felt proud of myself for maintaining boundaries and not engaging. That night, I told Olivia about the encounter, and she asked how I felt. I said I felt nothing, no anger or sadness or longing, just relief that I'd gotten out when I did. She squeezed my hand and said I deserved someone who built me up instead of tearing me down. I believed her. A year after the divorce, I got a message on LinkedIn from a former colleague who'd moved to another company. He said they were looking for a VP of engineering and wanted to know if I'd be interested in interviewing. I almost dismissed it immediately, the old doubts creeping in about whether I was ready for that level of responsibility. Then I thought about everything I'd survived, the systematic attempts to make me doubt myself, the destruction of something I'd worked so hard for, the rebuilding I'd done in therapy and in my career. I thought about the diploma hanging on my wall and what it represented, not just the degree itself, but my refusal to let anyone minimize what I'd achieved. I told my former colleague I was interested and asked him to send me the details. The interview process took 2 months and involved multiple rounds with different stakeholders. I prepared thoroughly, showcasing my leadership experience and the results my team had delivered. I was confident without being arrogant, knowledgeable without being condescending. I got the offer 3 weeks later with a compensation package that was almost double what I'd been making as director. I accepted immediately and gave my notice at my current company. My team threw me a going-away party, and several of them told me they'd learned more from me in 2 years than they had from previous managers in 5. That meant more to me than any title or salary increase. I started the VP role on a Monday morning feeling nervous but prepared. The company was larger and more established than my previous employer, with complex organizational dynamics and high expectations, but I'd proven to myself that I could handle pressure and lead effectively and adapt to new challenges. On my first day, I spent time meeting with each of my direct reports individually, learning about their goals and concerns and what they needed from me as their leader. I set up my office and hung my diploma on the wall, the replacement diploma with its small notation at the bottom that only I knew the meaning of. It was a reminder of what I'd overcome and what I'd refused to let anyone take from me. My parents came to visit a few weeks into the new job, and I gave them a tour of my office. My mom saw the diploma and got tears in her eyes. She said she remembered the day I'd graduated, how proud she'd been watching me walk across that stage. She said seeing it on the wall in my VP office felt like coming full circle. I hugged her and thought about how different my life could have been if I'd stayed with Natasha, if I'd let her resentment define me and limit me. I'd chosen myself instead, and it had made all the difference. 2 years after the divorce, I was living a life I'd designed for myself rather than one shaped by someone else's insecurities. Olivia and I had moved in together and were talking about getting engaged. I had a career I was proud of and a team I respected and challenges that pushed me to grow. I had friendships that were genuine and supportive. I had my diploma on the wall, replaced but not replaceable, a symbol of resilience more than achievement now. Sometimes I'd look at it and remember the sound of paper tearing, the sight of pieces falling to the floor, the feeling of something breaking inside me that day. But mostly I looked at it and saw proof that you can rebuild from destruction, that you don't have to accept someone else's narrative about your worth, that the people who try to diminish you are showing you their limitations, not yours. Natasha had tried to destroy the evidence of my achievement because she couldn't destroy the achievement itself. The degree was mine, earned through my work and my sacrifice and my persistence, and no one could take that away no matter how many pieces they tore the paper into. I'd learned that the hard way, but I'd learned it completely. And that education was worth more than anything printed on a diploma. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.